You're listening to Threadlocked, where every story you hear is true, unsettling, and unforgettable. Hi, I'm Jess, and I dig deep into real-life confessions, true crime cases, and bizarre experiences from everyday people like you. These stories aren't just told, they're locked in. This video covers a real unsolved crime involving a child victim and contains detailed discussion of the following topics: murder and violence against a child, sexual assault, decapitation and post-mortem mutilation, child abduction and neglect, discussion of race and systemic neglect in missing persons cases. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. This content may be disturbing or triggering for some audiences. Please take care while listening. This video is intended for educational and awareness purposes. It is based on publicly available records, credible reporting, and law enforcement sources. If any information presented is incorrect, please leave a comment or contact me directly. I will make the appropriate corrections upon further research and will always strive to represent victims' stories as accurate and respectfully as possible. On February 28, 1983, two men scavenging for scraps entered a derelict apartment building at 5635 Clemens Avenue in St. Louis's West End neighborhood. In the dark basement furnace room, the flicker of a lighter revealed a horrific sight: the headless body of a young African-American girl lying face down near the old boiler. The child was clothed only in a dirty yellow sweater, her small hands tightly bound behind her back with red and white nylon rope. The men alerted police immediately, setting in motion one of the most haunting, unsolved cases in St. Louis history. Veteran homicide detectives Joe Burgoon and Herb Riley arrived to a scene they would never forget. The victim at first looked like a small adult woman, but upon closer examination, police realized with shock that she was only about 8 to 11 years old, a child. Even seasoned officers were shaken by the brutality. The girl's head was missing, cleanly severed from her neck. This innocent victim would become known as St. Louis Jane Doe, nicknamed Hope or Precious Hope by investigators determined to give her memory some dignity. Police quickly secured the building, now a crime scene of almost surreal savagery. The child's body was nude except for a long-sleeved V-neck yellow sweater, which appeared stained and dirty. The sweater's manufacturer label had been torn out, suggesting the killer tried to eliminate a clue. Her wrists were bound with a red and white braided cord often used for small boats, further indicating a deliberate and prepared act. Notably, there was almost no blood at the scene, despite the beheading, a critical clue. The lack of blood and the clean nature of the decapitation led detectives to conclude the child had been killed elsewhere and her body placed in the basement days later. In fact, forensic mold growth on the remains suggested she had been dead approximately 4 to 5 days before discovery. This means she was likely killed in late February 1983 and dumped post-mortem in the abandoned building. Whoever the perpetrator was, they chose a hidden corner in a vacant structure, a spot a passerby would not stumble upon easily. As one report noted, the vacant 3-story brick building was off the main road. The killer likely knew of this secluded location and went there intentionally rather than by chance. Other evidence was painstakingly gathered. Detectives combed the building and surrounding area for the missing head or other clues. They searched storm drains, trash bins, and sewers across a 16-block radius but found nothing. The child's fingerprints and even footprints were recorded in case she could be matched to hospital birth records or prior fingerprints on file. Hairs and fibers were collected, though reports do not mention any unique findings from those. Remarkably, 2 coats of nail polish, one red, one purple, adorned her fingernails. The polished nails were a poignant detail, suggesting someone had cared enough to paint them, or perhaps the girl herself enjoyed bright colors. This clashed tragically with the violence done to her. An autopsy provided further grim details. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation. The killer choked the girl to death before severing her head. The decapitation was done post-mortem with a large blade, likely a serrated knife or a carving implement, making a clean cut through the neck. The medical examiner also found evidence of sexual assault on the child, confirming she had been raped. Her stomach was empty of food, indicating she hadn't eaten recently before she was killed. There are no signs of long-term abuse, such as old fractures or scars on her body. In fact, the girl appeared well-nourished and healthy prior to her death, with a medium brown complexion and no deformities aside from a minor anomaly, spina bifida occulta, noted later in a forensic analysis. This profile suggested she was not a neglected child, which deepened the mystery. Who was this girl, and why hadn't anyone reported her missing? The decapitation prevented the usual identification methods. With no head, investigators couldn't examine her teeth for dental records or create a standard facial reconstruction. They did preserve DNA from her blood and tissue, though DNA profiling was brand new in 1983, and entered her description into a national database. The child's height was estimated to be between 4 foot 10 inches and 5 foot 4 inches. With the head, she might have been around 5 foot tall, or slightly more. Weight was approximately 58 to 70 pounds. Apart from the rope and sweater, no other belongings or personal items were found with the body. No shoes, pants, underwear, or jewelry. It was as if her identity had been completely erased. A desperate investigation begins. From the moment the crime was discovered, St. Louis police threw themselves into the search for this girl's identity and killer. Every available detective was put on the case, treating it with the highest priority despite the many other crimes in the city. Investigators immediately canvassed the neighborhood. They went door to door across 16 square blocks, showing a description of the girl and the sweater to residents, hoping someone would say, "That sounds like so-and-so." They even searched dumpsters, alleys, and snow-covered ground for the missing head or any discarded evidence, but found nothing. Realizing the girl could have come from anywhere, detectives broadened their search nationwide. They pulled school attendance records for the St. Louis region, looking for any girls aged around 9 who suddenly stopped showing up in early 1983. They scoured police missing persons reports across the country, teletyping her description to law enforcement far and wide. Every black-oriented newspaper and magazine in the U.S. received notices about the case, an outreach effort led by Homicide Commander Lieutenant Leroy Atkins, who wanted to ensure the news reached communities that mainstream media might overlook. Tips began to trickle in, but heartbreakingly, no family came forward to claim the child. Investigators dubbed the victim Little Jane Doe and unofficially Hope, symbolizing their hope of one day identifying her. The case weighed heavily on the department. Atkins, the city's first black homicide division commander, later said, "It's unimaginable to me that a kid can come up missing and no one knows a thing. How a child that age can't belong to anybody." As an African-American officer, Atkins also felt a responsibility to show the black community that the police cared as much about a black little girl as any other victim. The detectives took this to heart. They worked around the clock for any break in the case. Despite exhaustive efforts, initial leads led nowhere. Within a week, police had no name for their Jane Doe, nor any strong suspect. It was as if the child had lived in isolation. Frustrated, detectives even enlisted unconventional help, a psychic. In a much-criticized move, investigators sent the victim's yellow sweater to a self-proclaimed psychic in Florida who claimed she might get a reading from touching it. Tragically, this yielded no answers. The sweater was lost in the mail and never returned, eliminating a key piece of evidence. The media coverage of the case in 1983 was initially intense in St. Louis, with newspapers running headlines about the headless girl and local TV reporting the few known facts. However, without an identity or photograph of the victim, the story struggled to gain national traction. Some observers later pointed out that missing black children in the 1980s often received comparatively little national media attention, a phenomenon of neglect. In this case, St. Louis police themselves tried to generate publicity, even getting short articles in outlets like Jet Magazine or the Associated Press. But unlike the famous Atlanta child murders a few years prior, the mystery of one unidentified black girl did not become a household story nationwide. Within months, media coverage waned, even as investigators quietly kept the case open. On December 2nd, 1983, After 9 months with no breakthroughs, the little girl was laid to rest. Police organized a small funeral for Jane Doe in Washington Park Cemetery at Pauper's Graveyard. The ceremony was profoundly sad. A minister presided over the burial of a girl we do not know, but surely she is known to God, and detectives served as pallbearers for the small white casket. Only a handful of officers and journalists attended. No family members came to mourn. Veteran Sergeant Herb Riley was quoted saying, "I'm really saddened that no one showed up. I just can't believe that no one has missed her." The grave was unmarked for an identifying case number. Even in burial, the little girl remained nameless, a poignant symbol of the injustice that still needed to be solved. A city in turmoil. To understand the case's context, it's important to picture St. Louis in the early 1980s. Like many American cities, St. Louis was grappling with rising violent crime and urban decay. The population had declined, and entire neighborhoods had started deteriorating, vacant buildings, like the one where Jane Doe was found. Police resources were stretched thin by a high homicide rate and other serious crimes. Yet even amid this crime wave, the murder of an unknown little girl stood out for its brutality and brazenness. Detectives who witnessed the scene later said they carried the image with them forever. It became one of the most baffling, horrendous, and bizarre crimes in the history of the St. Louis Police Department, according to news reports. At the time, public awareness of missing children was growing. The first milk carton kids appeared in 1984, but there was also a stark racial gap in whose cases drew attention. Missing African American children often did not receive the same level of media coverage or public outrage as missing white children, a disparity that the police team in this case consciously tried to overcome. Commander Atkins' outreach to black media outlets and community leaders was likely driven by this knowledge. He did not want Precious Hope to be forgotten due to her race. The local African American community was horrified by the crime. Yet without an identification, there was a limit to organizing searches or rallies, as one might for a known missing child. Jane Doe was literally the girl nobody seemed to miss, as one article noted. Despite the limitations of 1980s forensics, no DNA profiling yet, no nationwide computer databases like today, the St. Louis police did everything in their power. They manually checked school rosters line by line, followed up on thousands of leads, and consulted the FBI's national crime analysts, who told them they had not a single case similar to this on file. This was not a pattern crime that anyone recognized. It was unique and deeply disturbing. In the decades since 1983, the case of Precious Hope has generated numerous theories and speculative leads. Investigators chased many of them, desperate for a break. Some of the notable twists and dead ends include parallel crimes. Early on, police investigated whether the murder was the work of a serial offender. They learned of a mental patient in Alabama who had beheaded a woman and was suspected in 2 similar beheadings in East St. Louis. This individual was scrutinized, but no connection to the little girl was found. Another suspect was a Texas serial killer on death row who had murdered a 13-year-old girl and bragged of killing others, possibly in Missouri. Again, nothing definite tied him to the St. Louis Jane Doe. The Precious Doe case. In 2001, an eerily similar crime occurred in Kansas City, Missouri. A decapitated African-American girl around 3 years old was found, dubbed Precious Doe. For 4 years, that case, too, went unsolved. Investigators in St. Louis watched it closely, wondering if there might be a broader pattern or even a copycat. Ultimately, Precious Doe was identified in 2005 as 3-year-old Erica Green, and shockingly, her killers turned out to be her own mother and stepfather. They had cut off Erica's head with garden clippers to conceal her identity. This revelation, while unrelated to the St. Louis case, suggested a chilling theory. Could Jane Doe's killer have been a relative trying to hide the crime? After all, both victims were young black girls whose heads were removed to prevent identification. The Kansas City case showed that even a mother could commit such an atrocity. St. Louis detectives could not ignore the possibility that their Jane Doe might have suffered a similar intimate betrayal. Local suspicions. Veteran St. Louis detective Tom Carroll, who inherited the case later in the 1990s, became convinced that a known St. Louis child killer named Vernon Brown, was responsible. Brown was a convicted serial predator who strangled a 9-year-old girl in St. Louis in 1986 and had nearly decapitated a 19-year-old woman in 1985. He was also suspected in a 1980 murder of a child in Indiana. Detective Carroll noted the similarities. Brown had a pattern of tying up little girls and killing them. One theory Carroll advanced was that Jane Doe might have been the daughter or stepdaughter of Brown or one of his girlfriends. Perhaps Brown took in a girlfriend's young daughter and later murdered her without anyone outside the family knowing. This was speculative, but Brown seemed like the most plausible suspect in the absence of others. In 2005, Carroll personally visited Brown in prison on the eve of the killer's execution to confront him and plead for a confession. Brown, however, flatly denied involvement and went to his death without admitting anything. Carroll still felt in his gut that Brown was the culprit, but with Brown dead and no evidence, this lead hit a dead end. Bizarre leads. Some tips verged on the strange. At one point, investigators looked at an abduction from Chicago around that time, but it did not match. A human skull found in a St. Louis storage locker was tested to see if it belonged to the girl. It didn't. One Kansas City-based insurance investigator became fixated on the case and claimed that Jane Doe was actually a Native American child from Minnesota with a drifter as the killer. Her elaborate theory proved baseless. Detectives truly left no stone unturned. They even conducted a seance in a suburb at one point, hoping for any insight from psychic methods, illustrating how few solid leads they had. Through all these twists, one fact never changed. The girl's identity remained unknown. Every few years, local media would revisit the case, often around anniversaries, and police would appeal to the public again. But without new evidence, the trail was cold. Could she be from elsewhere? One persistent question was why no one in St. Louis reported a missing girl fitting her description. Early on, this led to theories that she might not have been local. Perhaps she was from another state, or even another country, brought to St. Louis by the killer. In 2013, as we'll discuss next, scientific tests actually suggested she likely grew up outside Missouri. Detectives also considered that she might have lived a secluded life, possibly kept out of school or away from neighborhoods. One theory was that the child's parents or caretakers were the perpetrators, which would explain why no missing report was filed. It's a horrifying thought, but cases like Erica Green proved it could happen. Another angle was the possibility of a ritual or occult killing. In the early 1980s, fears of satanic ritual abuse were on the rise in the U.S. The fact that Jane Doe's blood was drained and her head removed led some to wonder if this was a ritualistic crime. For example, some Afro-Caribbean occult practices have involved human remains. However, law enforcement found no concrete evidence of occult symbols or ceremony at the scene. No candles, writings, or specific mutilations beyond the decapitation. While they didn't rule out the idea entirely, investigators tended to lean toward a more conventional criminal motive, such as a pedophile or twisted individual, rather than an organized cult. For decades, her case haunted the St. Louis community. The police never closed it, and many who were young officers in 1983 carried the memory into their retirements. The nickname Precious Hope was occasionally used in memorial articles, a bittersweet reminder that they hoped one day to call her by her real name. New forensic leads. Time and technology have breathed new life into the case in recent years. In 2013, 30 years after the murder, St. Louis authorities decided to exhume the little girl's remains to apply modern forensic testing. This decision led to some unexpected hurdles. Records at Washington Park Cemetery were so poor that at first they couldn't find her grave. The child's casket had been misplaced among many unmarked graves. After a painstaking effort, including using old photos and even 2D camera calibration techniques to pinpoint the burial spot, her remains were finally located and exhumed in June 2013. The remains were examined by experts, including at the Smithsonian Institution and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Using stable isotope analysis, scientists tested her bones for chemical signatures absorbed from drinking water and food during her life. These isotopic markers can often narrow down the geographic region where a person grew up. The results were intriguing. They suggested that Jane Doe had likely spent her life in the southeastern United States. According to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch report on the findings, she most likely came from one of 10 states. Somewhere like Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, Tennessee, or the Carolinas. In contrast, NCMEC's interpretation of the data pointed to some Midwestern or Mid-Atlantic states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, or West Virginia as possibilities. There's some overlap, for example, Indiana or Ohio versus Arkansas or Texas, but both analyses agreed on one thing. It was unlikely she was a native of Missouri. This reinforced the theory that she had been brought to St. Louis only shortly before her death, which might explain why no local report matched her. Examiners also discovered a physical trait that had gone unknown. The girl had a condition called spina bifida occulta at her sacrum, lower spine. This is a mild form of spina bifida, where one of the vertebrae doesn't fully close. Often, it's asymptomatic, and indeed, they couldn't tell if it affected her. Likely it did not in any obvious way. Still, this detail was added to her profile, since in rare cases, it might ring a bell if a family member remembered a doctor mentioning it when she was born. With the exhumation, DNA sampling was also done using modern techniques. A complete DNA profile of the victim was obtained and uploaded to a national database, like CODIS, the FBI's system for missing persons. To date, this DNA has not matched any known missing child or relative in those databases. However, the new profile opened the door for cutting-edge genealogy techniques. In recent years, cases as old as this have been solved by genetic genealogy, using DNA to find family members via genealogy websites. St. Louis investigators have indeed been working with agencies to explore genealogical matches for Precious Hope. By 2020, there was growing public interest thanks to true crime forums and even a documentary. In 2022, an independent documentary titled Our Precious Hope, St. Louis's Little Jane Doe Revisited was released. It brought together retired detectives like Joe Burgoon and modern forensic experts reviewing all the evidence and theories. The documentary, available on streaming platforms, helped renew community focus on the case. The nickname Precious Hope became more widely used as a humane moniker for the girl. The filmmakers worked alongside police, and intriguingly, by the time of the 40th anniversary in 2023, a potential new lead had emerged from the public. In mid-2023, nearly 40 years after the crime, a startling tip surfaced on the internet that has given investigators fresh hope. A user on Reddit posted a personal story in the subreddit RBI, Reddit Bureau of Investigation forum, about their missing sister, 9-year-old Janetta Brooks, who disappeared from St. Louis in early 1983. According to the post, corroborated by later interviews, Janetta was born in 1973 and had been living with her grandparents in Indiana until her estranged father took her to St. Louis in January 1983. After February 1983, Janetta was never seen again by her extended family. The Reddit user, her sibling, described how their mother was in prison at the time, and the father gained custody of Janetta, only to seemingly drop off the radar with the child around the same time our Jane Doe was found. Crucially, Janetta's father had a long criminal history and reportedly gave conflicting accounts about what happened to his daughter. Relatives from the father's side admitted they had not seen Janetta since early 1983, and that when Janetta's mother tried to contact the girl after her prison release, the father refused. The dates align uncannily. Janetta Brooks was last confirmed alive on February 14, 1983, when her stepsister babysat her, and after that, she vanished. The unidentified girl was found exactly 2 weeks later, on February 28th. When this Reddit story came to light, it immediately got the attention of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police. Detectives publicly announced in June 2023 that they viewed this lead as credible and sought to speak with the original poster of the story. They likely have since obtained DNA from Janetta's surviving family to compare with the Jane Doe. As of the latest updates, early 2025, the police have not officially confirmed a match, but many are hopeful that Precious Hope may finally have a name, Janetta. If confirmed, it would mean her own father was the prime suspect, which tragically mirrors the Kansas City Precious Doe case. The investigation into the father's activities in 1983 is ongoing. He is still alive, in his mid-70s, and has not been charged as of this recording. This potential identification would close one chapter, the question of who the victim is, and open another, the pursuit of justice for Janetta. Detectives have said they never gave up, and now it seems the persistence may pay off. For over 40 years, the little girl found in that basement remained a voiceless symbol of a terrible crime. Advances in forensic science and the power of persistent storytelling have inched this case closer to resolution. If Janetta Brooks is indeed St. Louis's Jane Doe, she will finally have her name restored and a family, however belatedly, to mourn her. The next step would be securing accountability for her murder. Even as we await final confirmation, the legacy of this case has shown a light on issues beyond the crime itself. The way missing Black children's cases can slip through the cracks, the importance of preserving evidence for decades, and the incredible impact modern DNA technology can have on cold cases. In memory of Precious Hope, St. Louis authorities reinterred her remains in 2014 in a special garden at Calvary Cemetery preserved for unknown children. There she rests among other Garden of Innocence graves, under a marker that no longer just says Jane Doe, but includes the epitaph Precious Hope. It's a promise that she will not be forgotten. In a poignant reflection on the case, retired Detective Burgoon once said he wouldn't retire until he saw it solved. Many who worked it echoed that sentiment. They imagine the day they can replace her alias on her grave with her true name and perhaps tell the world a little about who she was in life, her favorite color, her smile, anything. Until then, they continue to pursue every lead. 40 years is a long time, but hope has no statute of limitations. The story of St. Louis's unidentified girl reminds us that every victim matters, and as long as the case remains unsolved, the investigator's oath to speak for the voiceless continues. The little girl in the yellow sweater has a voice through those who tell her story. Someday soon, we hope that voice will be heard in court, and the person responsible for this heinous act will answer for it. If you have any information on the 1983 St. Louis Jane Doe case, please contact the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department or your local FBI office. After all these years, even the smallest clue could finally bring Precious Hope the justice she deserves. Thank you for listening to Threadlocked. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay locked in with new episodes. If you're tuning in on Spotify or your favorite podcast platform, hit follow and rate the show if you're enjoying these stories. Got a story of your own? You can send it in. I just might read it next. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and stay locked.